On a map, it is easy to notice that Europe has far more countries than South America. However, South American countries are generally much larger in size. So why are these two regions divided so differently? Let's explore the reasons why South American countries tend to be much larger than European ones. This can be seen in several ways. For comparison, we will look at the 12 independent countries of South America and the 43 countries of Europe, excluding countries whose territory lies mostly in Asia, such as Russia and Turkey. Right away, we find an important clue. South America has 12 countries covering a total area of about 17.7 million square kilometers. That means the average country size is roughly 1.5 million square kilometers, larger than Peru, the world's 20th largest country. Meanwhile, these 43 European countries together cover just under 6 million square kilometers. In other words, Europe has more than 3 times as many countries, occupying only about 1/3 the land area of South America. On average, each European country covers about 139,000 square kilometers, only slightly larger than Greece, which ranks around 95th in the world by area. There are other ways to look at this as well. Ukraine is the largest country located entirely within Europe. Yet if it were in South America, it would rank only 8th in size. That's because 7 of South America's 12 countries are larger than Ukraine. Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Chile. In fact, Ukraine is smaller than some Brazilian states. Amazonas, Pará, and Mato Grosso all have larger areas than Ukraine. Before examining why this happened, it is important to recognize a major historical factor. To trace the origins of European countries, we often have to go back many centuries. In many cases, modern states developed from small territorial units that gradually expanded or merged over time. European history is filled with changing borders, territorial expansion, and political fragmentation. Modern Italy and Germany emerged through unification processes during the second half of the 19th century, but their roots can be traced back to older entities such as Rome and Prussia. Consider other examples such as Denmark and San Marino. Denmark's flag has existed for more than 800 years and is often regarded as the world's oldest continuously used national flag. San Marino, a small country surrounded by Italy, is commonly considered the world's oldest surviving sovereign state, with a history dating back to the 4th century. In other words, Europe has a long history of competition among city-states, kingdoms, empires, and emerging nation-states. South America's history, by contrast, is very different. When Europeans arrived, the continent was already home to many indigenous peoples with their own histories and cultures. However, population density was significantly lower, and the available territory was much larger. To understand South America's current political structure, one key event is the Treaty of Tordesillas, the agreement between the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire that divided the New World between them. Over time, Portugal expanded far beyond the original dividing line, especially into the Amazon in the interior of the continent. This expansion was later partially recognized through agreements such as the Treaty of Madrid in 1750, creating borders that closely resemble those of modern Brazil. Brazil maintained its territorial unity over the centuries. Today, it is the world's 5th largest country, which naturally increases the average size of South American states. Meanwhile, Spain's possessions were divided into several large administrative units, including the Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Viceroyalty of Peru, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, and the Captaincy General of Chile. These administrative divisions later became the foundation for modern countries. Not all of them remained intact. For example, New Granada eventually split into Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador, and at one point also included Panama and parts of present-day Brazil. Even so, the resulting countries remained very large because the original territories themselves had been enormous and were not divided many times. In addition, from their centers of power, the new states were able to extend authority over vast, harsh, and sparsely populated regions. This occurred in Brazil with the Amazon, and in Argentina, in Chile with Patagonia. In simple terms, many modern European countries grew from small territorial units that gradually expanded. South America, on the other hand, was initially divided into 2 enormous colonial spheres. One remained largely intact and became Brazil, while the other fragmented into a relatively small number of countries. Since the Wars of Independence roughly 200 years ago, South America has seen very few new countries emerge. Notable exceptions include Suriname and Guyana, which gained independence from the Netherlands and Britain little more than half a century ago. Europe, by contrast, continued producing new states until very recently. The most obvious example is the breakup of Yugoslavia, which resulted in the 6 countries that exist today. However, history alone does not explain everything. Geography also plays a crucial role. Europe is not only smaller but also heavily fragmented by peninsulas, islands, rivers, valleys, and mountain ranges. This fragmentation encouraged the emergence of many independent centers of power located close to one another, without necessarily being governed by the same state. A prosperous city-state situated along a river could easily trade with the outside world without depending on a distant political center. South America's geography is quite different. Although the continent contains enormous natural barriers such as the Andes Mountains separating Chile and Argentina, it also includes vast plains that make movement and territorial control easier, such as the Pampas and the Orinoco Plains. At the same time, many huge regions, including Patagonia, the Amazon, and Mato Grosso, have historically been difficult to settle. This allowed already established states to extend their claims over these territories more easily than would have been possible in densely populated areas. Take Brazil's Amazonas state as an example. It covers nearly 1.6 million square kilometers. Even the combined area of 31 European countries would still fall short of that figure. Yet Amazonas has a population of only about 4 million people. Europe, on the other hand, has a much larger population and contains a remarkable variety of cultures, languages, and traditions. Bringing all these groups together under a single state has historically been extremely difficult. In fact, many South American countries were established with borders that included territories their governments did not yet fully control. Political maps were often drawn before large-scale settlement and development actually occurred. Beyond all these factors, there is one more important reason: the existence of Europe's microstates. Andorra, Malta, Liechtenstein, San Marino, Monaco, and Vatican City together cover only a little over 1,000 square kilometers. Each has its own unique story, explaining how it emerged and managed to maintain independence, despite being surrounded by much larger neighbors such as Spain, France, or Italy. Brazil, by contrast, is a classic example of a country that remained unified after gaining independence from Portugal. Brazil alone is roughly 8,500 times larger than the combined area of those 6 European microstates. In summary, South American countries are not larger simply because the continent itself is bigger. They are large because the region inherited enormous colonial administrative units. Many borders were drawn across sparsely populated territories. States absorbed vast interior spaces, and political fragmentation remained relatively low compared to Europe. Meanwhile, today's map of Europe is the product of centuries of competition among kingdoms, city-states, empires, duchies, principalities, and microstates. That is why a smaller continent contains far more countries, and why the process of political division continued well into the modern era.